Welcome, everybody. My name is Drew Dyke. I am the International Relations Officer for SALAM for Democracy and Human Rights. I work mainly to extend SALAM for Democracy and Human Rights' work at the UN and with international partners. This interview tonight is part of an occasional series of videos and interviews that we are undertaking in order to explore issues relating to Bahrain, human rights issues in different countries. And tonight we have the pleasure of having Callum Robertson, who is our Salam for Democracy and Human Rights UK advocacy lead. But in particular, we're honored to have the presence of Lord Scriven, Paul Scriven. He tells me that he prefers to be known as Paul, but I'll say Lord Scriven at this introductory stage. He was raised, as I understand, in Huddersfield. He can correct me where I make a mistake. Was very engaged in student politics in Manchester, where indeed I went to university, but just down the road, and was later the head of Sheffield Council, as I understand it, and has been a life peer since 2014. Now, I noticed on his Lord's profile that it says that he is interested in or has a focus on human rights in Bahrain as a specific focus. And actually, that's where I'd like to start, Paul, if you wouldn't mind. Why does your Lord's profile page state that you have an interest in human rights in Bahrain? What's your connection or your familiarity with the country? Why should we, it's an ally, why should we care about human rights there?
We should care about human rights wherever they are being suppressed, because if we are to be seen as a force for change and being seen as a progressive country, we have to stand up for the values that we believe in. And human rights have always been important to me, but specifically not in Bahrain, actually, when I went into the House of Lords. It was by default, not by design, that I've become more and more involved in Bahraini issues and around human rights. And about possibly a year after I'd been in the House of Lords, I read a newspaper article in one of the broadsheets in the UK saying that the UK government had got a training scheme for some of the Bahraini organisations, the Special Investigation Unit, the Ombudsman, the police, and security services to improve. And the article said that this British taxpayer-funded scheme had brought some Bahraini officials from the Bahraini police over to Northern Ireland to look at how to do community policing. Now, those of you who are listening who don't understand the history of the UK, Northern Ireland Police is not probably the most kind of up at the top of the league for the police force that's renowned for community policing, and has a history of maybe not being the best in the UK. So I asked a few naive questions about what criteria the government were using, how they were making sure that this money was used and it was seen as improving human rights in Bahrain, why they'd chosen Northern Ireland. And I think a number of NGOs, non-government organisations who had an interest in Bahrain suddenly thought, who is this strange person in the Lords, this Lord, asking questions about something and he's not on our radar? And when I got the answers back, I became more and more confused and suspicious about what was going on. So I decided it was my duty as a parliamentarian to read up a bit more about what was going on in Bahrain, and to continue pursuing the line of inquiry that I had. And over since 2015 right through to today, apparently I'm the parliamentarian that asks most questions on Bahrain in both houses of parliament. I think the Bahraini embassy in London sees me as somebody who's active around human rights and pressing and pushing the British government as well as the Bahraini government on what's happening, and actually taken up a number of individual cases within Parliament to try to get the British government to act. So naive questions and then a bit of research and help from non-government organisations has kind of been my interest, to the point now where I am totally and utterly committed to improving and working to improve human rights, and to hold the British and Bahraini authorities to account for what's happening over there.
So it's an special specialism. Over to you. Notice, you guys. Now back to you, Callum. I noticed that Salam for Democracy and Human Rights welcomed the announcement by the UK government that it will implement human rights sanctions inspired by the fate of the Russian taxation whistleblower Sergei Magnitsky, following, and this was following the lead of 2012 legislation in the United States. What is the scope of this Magnitsky inspired legislation, and why did Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, SALAM DHR, welcome it? What's it got to do with Bahrain?
So I think that there's two things. There's to take the scope and then to take the relation to Bahrain. First of all, the scope of this legislation is potentially very wide. It's potentially very wide-reaching in how heavy the sanctions, the financial sanctions, can be, as long as they've got some sort of asset within the United Kingdom. We know in the case of Bahrain, there is a significant number of people who have strong assets in the United Kingdom, who may or may not be complicit. We don't know exactly, but obviously, if it came to light that they were complicit, then the sanctions should be applied. To address why it's particularly relevant to Bahrain, is because we, as an ally of Bahrain, and the United Kingdom government is an ally of Bahrain, have been quite silent on human rights abuses there. And this is a tool for the government to say, if they're committed to human rights, if they're truly committed to human rights abroad, then they've got to put their money where their mouth is and put sanctions on their allies as well as their friends. We saw a positive step with the Saudi Arabians, but I would like to see further extension of the sanctions to all offenders, regardless of the relationship their state has with ours.
Thanks for that. Lord Scriven, Paul Scriven, is it really in the UK's interests to invoke these provisions against Bahraini leaders if they are found somehow to be culpable? As I say, Bahrain is an ally to the UK. The UK has a military facility there. The Al Khalifa family is close to the UK's royal family. How do you see, with your acquired interest in this issue, how do you see these Magnitsky-inspired human rights sanctions working, and could they be invoked in respect to Bahrain?
Well, I think the answer is yes, they could. But my worry is that they will be applied subjectively if there isn't proper criteria of how they're going to be applied across whether somebody is an ally or a non-ally. So I think the government has to set a clear set of criteria of how these sanctions will be implemented and against whom. And I see no reason why they shouldn't be. If we can get that, then you're able to make not subjective but objective opinions about which individuals these sanctions should be applied against. And if there are people in Bahrain, as there are highly likely to be people in Bahrain who would not meet the criteria for not having sanctions applied, would have to have sanctions applied. It doesn't matter whether some country is an ally or a non-ally. If you're running an ethical, human rights-based foreign policy based on objective criteria, then it's applied to Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Russia, or anywhere else in the world based on objective criteria. So I think that's what's got to happen. Otherwise, what will happen, because as you've already said, the military base, the arms trade that we have, the long relationship we have, maybe the government doesn't want to tip the boat too much, and they won't be applied. And that's why I think we need significant objective criteria about how these sanctions will be applied. And therefore it doesn't become, is it this country or that country? It becomes, they haven't met this threshold, and we apply it across the board for anybody who hasn't met that threshold.
But you don't necessarily see a contradiction in the notion that a country can be allied to, be friends with another country, even if against that particular country, specific individuals are named as part of these human rights sanctions. There's no contradiction in that, or do you find there to be a contradiction in that?
I think in an international world, totally drawing up a drawbridge is not a good thing to do. I think a combination of sanctions and working with people who are abusing human rights is possibly the best way to do it. What isn't acceptable is to ignore human rights abusers or put them second and third on the list of how you want to engage with a country. So you put the military position, alliances, or trade first and human rights third. I don't see a contradiction so long as sanctions are applied in a uniformed way, and that countries know, whether it's an ally or a non-ally, that if certain thresholds are not met on how they govern their country and deal with individual human beings, then sanctions will be issued. And that's not about us as a country deciding whether somebody's an ally or not. It's saying these are our values, this is what we believe and hold in human rights, and if you don't live up to those, then we will apply sanctions. And if you wish to remain a friend, and if you wish to remain friendly with us, then there are real issues for you as a nation about how you deal with human rights. So I think it can be used as a positive thing, and I don't see it as a contradiction if used well, if used objectively, and then applied uniformly.
Thanks for that. Just one final quick little follow-up on this point. Since the introduction, since the announcement of these provisions, have you seen from government any indication of the development of the clear criteria that you're talking about?
Absolutely not. And in fact, the case of the two young men who are on death row, whose case was just upheld in the last week, when that was raised, the government seemed more to take a passive approach than a clear approach. And I think there isn't any criteria. I don't see any significant action on criteria, and I think that's where I, as a parliamentarian, really want to push, because I think it's an absolute missing part of the jigsaw in terms of how the UK government will apply these sanctions.
I completely agree. I think just to jump in there slightly, I mean, we saw it with the OSJAs, so the Overseas Security and Justice Assessments, where there's very clear criteria there, that the criterion, or shall I say, the criteria appear to be selectively applied. So I think that there has to be not only clear and transparent guidance, but that transparency has to be very, very key there in order to have accountable decision making.
But just to pick up on a couple of those points, a couple of those strands, Callum, now Lord Scriven, Paul Scriven, has just referred to the cases of two individuals whose death sentence has been upheld by the Court of Cassation. It now falls to the King of Bahrain to ratify on recommendation of the Minister of Justice or not. There were questions in Parliament, and of course the House of Lords, and Paul Scriven has himself taken part in some of those questions. Nevertheless, James Cleverly, who's the UK Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, noted that the UK government provides assistance to, well, foreign governments, the government of Bahrain, but he made it clear that it does not help in any way to facilitate human rights abuses. Such a relationship is held constantly in review I'm quoting from Hansard, it's held in review and they review our relationships regularly. So obviously, by definition, our relationship with Bahrain and any future technical assistance will be assessed against the criteria that we have put out. Why are these assurances not good enough for you?
I think it's all well and good having an assurance, but an assurance only works if the assurance is backed up by action. And I think that the thing that really strikes me about James Cleverly's approach to this as the minister responsible is you saw it with his intervention on Israel-Palestine a few weeks ago. He is willing to take action. He was very vocal at the UN in condemning the annexation plans. But it seems that he again is taking this almost selective approach to it, and unfortunately, in this scenario, the selective approach has the impact of two people whose confessions were extracted under torture losing their lives. I think that's what we're dealing with. That's why the assurance isn't good enough. This isn't some theft charge that you get 2 years in prison and a slap on the wrist for. This is a capital issue in the literal sense of the term. That's why those assurances aren't good enough. And the British government is in a strong position with Bahrain. They can force them to U-turn, and the fact they don't is baffling, I have to say.
Lord Scriven, what are your views how the UK government has handled this issue, the case of these two individuals? I saw that you made an intervention in the House of Lords. This case has gone through now. There are 12 known individuals on death row. What, in light of these assurances and so on, how has it been handled? What more can they do?
Look, I think we've got to be honest. The British government with Bahrain, the present British government with Bahrain, has a view that the military significance of the naval base, the arms trade that we have with Bahrain, and the significance it sees as having a presence in the region through Bahrain outstrips human rights. I'm very clear about that. If you'd have asked me this when I first came into it, in 2015, I wouldn't have had that view. I came in naively. The more I got into it, the more I realised that human rights are not centre and square of the British government's approach to dealing with Bahrain. Now, interestingly, I think there is a view at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that the technical assistance, they want to see Bahrain improve. But the fact is that since the technical assistance has been in place, since 2017, say for example, the use of the death penalty has gone up by 1,250%. There are 12 individuals now on death row in Bahrain. State murder through the death penalty has been reintroduced in the last few years. So I think there are real issues that the government have got itself into a cul-de-sac in the UK, a one-way street, where it somehow just can't bring itself to say that the technical assistance isn't working the way that it wanted it to do. I think they went in with good intentions, and therefore you get these words and these assurances that are not backed up by action, which is why it's really important that both parliamentarians and non-government organisations keep the pressure on the government and don't take the spotlight off this. Eventually, the government will crack if the spotlight is kept on, but the spotlight has to be kept on because it's just in a position of not being able to say we need to review the technical assistance. I mean, let's be clear, Bahrain is, in terms of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, a country of concern. That means it has concerns publicly. It says that around human rights, but it just cannot then bring itself to the next step to say things aren't improving the way we want, and therefore will take action. And as Callum said, the UK government, because of the relationship that we have with Bahrain, is in a strong position to even very quietly have strong words to make sure that reform happens. But I think that, as I said, I think that's third to trade and to the military alliance and positioning of the naval base there at the moment.
So speaking on the 9th of July, James, picking up those points in a way, James Cleverly said that despite the Court of Cassation decision, that will not be the end of our efforts to prevent the death penalty in Bahrain. So despite this predicament, this cul-de-sac that you've referred to, what more practically can they do? Would we see any of it, or do you think it would be behind closed doors and consist of very strong words?
I'm absolutely sure that there will be words having behind closed doors. I'm very clear about that. You know, I have no doubt that the British ambassador there will be having words, and possibly ministers will be getting involved. So I think it would be naive to say that isn't happening. However, different things have to happen. It's got to be called out publicly in a much stronger set of words in terms of what the British government's position is and why they are absolutely adamant that these two young men and the others on death row should not be put to death, particularly these two young men. I mean, let's be clear, you know, even the tarnished investigations unit did say that torture had been used in the confessions of these two young men. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And then the Court of Cassation actually used the same evidence to convict them to their final death sentence. Yeah. Now, under any circumstance, the British government should be saying, this is unjust, it is not justified, it's completely unwarranted, and we as an ally say, no, we will not support you supporting these deaths publicly. If then the Bahraini government does, then I think there are real issues about the technical assistance and threatening the technical assistance. And I think this is why this is really important. It's not just a hard fact that the British government are giving them technical assistance. It's a fig leaf of respectability that the British government and the British system is helping them to improve. They use it time and time again, the Bahrainians, as a fig leaf for then the underlying issues against human rights which are going on there. So that's why I think it's really important that if the British government said, stop, we're now having an independent, open, transparent review into whether the technical assistance program is working, and if not, we will think about either changing it or withdrawing. I think that holds a significant problem for the Bahrainis authorities, because that fig leaf goes. So I think that's why we're in a strong position, and action, words and deeds have to follow.
Just to pick, that's an incredibly interesting point. Callum, as a campaigner advocate, this is not something that we have addressed before. That is to say, calling into question the utility, the kind of morality of that assistance package, the judicial assistance package to Bahrain. Is that the kind of thing that you could see SALAM DHR questioning publicly? Is that the kind of, is that where advocacy is going, saying, look, if this relationship UK Bahrain is one that is just centered on the arms and the military presence and so on, and human rights does take the back seat that Lord Scriven, Paul Scriven, has referred to, then goodness me, that this technical assistance has got to go. Would that be somewhere that you might be willing to go?
I think absolutely, and I think in order to sort of show past precedent, in Salam's recent submission 2 weeks ago, our submission to the Integrated Review inquiry by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee called into question the transparency protocols of OSJAs. We have form in challenging the government when their protocols are not being used effectively. I think this is a prime example of where we have evidence that they're not being used effectively. In fact, they're being used detrimentally. Yeah. And when they're being used detrimentally, I think we have a duty as an NGO to call it out.
Yeah. Back to you, Paul Scriven. You are from Huddersfield originally. Yeah. Mm-hmm. As you may be aware, a higher learning institute in your city of origin, the Huddersfield University, is under scrutiny for its links with the Bahraini police. Now, as a Huddersfield lad, if I can put it that way, what's your awareness of the university's link with the Bahraini police, and what's your sense of it? Is it something that is a problem?
It's a bit like the technical assistance program. I don't believe in absolutely withdrawing all support if you can actually work to improve things. And higher education and academics could play a significant role in there. However, the Huddersfield University link really worries me. As you say, first of all, as somebody from Huddersfield, my whole family still lives there. I support the local football team. I grew up there. And to see my town of origin, my birth town, being involved in a country where human rights are really questionable, I found it really, really difficult, just on a human level, because of my connection to that town. Now, the issue for me with Huddersfield University is the more we dug into what they're doing, the more worried I am that there is no governance and no way of Huddersfield measuring whether what they're doing is helping to improve human rights or actually helping the Bahrainis to undermine human rights. And let me explain why. So I wrote to the Vice Chancellor, the senior official at Huddersfield University, asking how they'd got the contract, what due diligence they'd done in terms of assessing human rights, what criteria they're using for assessing the impact of what they're doing, and how they're measuring the impact of improvement or deterioration of human rights with the organisations that they're working with. The polite and long letter got responded to by a very short, sharp freedom of information request, which in the UK is a way of asking an institution for information, and legally they've got to provide it. So it wasn't it was literally, this is what it is. It's commercially sensitive, a lot of this issue, because it's a contract and you're not having it. The more that we've dug into this and the more I've pursued this, the more and more it's clear that I don't think there was a contract. I think the relationship between the former Chancellor, Prince Andrew, a member of the British royal family, influenced how Huddersfield University got that contract. There is evidence that Prince Andrew met significant people before that contract was given. It's quite clear there is no due diligence. When I got a response from them about what due diligence and investigations they did about human rights, they quoted the former British Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying it's okay to do business with Bahrain. So the logic of that is the next time that the British government says that British universities are getting paid enough, then Huddersfield University won't be able to argue against, because they believe every word that the British government tells them on any policy. There is no significant due diligence. There is no significant strategic approach that they've been able to show us on how they are monitoring the improvement or deterioration of human rights. It's quite clear they haven't done any real investigation into some of the organisations they're working with, or some of the individuals from the organisations. And it's now been identified that some of the very buildings where they're doing their graduation schemes are some of the very buildings where human rights abuses and torture are taking place. That's the significant kind of evidence that's been recently reported. So I'm really worried. I'm really worried that, again, for good reasons possibly, Huddersfield University went into this, but when you start asking them serious questions about their governance and their monitoring of what they're doing to improve the human rights conditions in Bahrain, they're not able to answer. And I think their senior management are really trying to whitewash their approach within Bahrain. So very worried. And again, a bit like the British government, this campaign's not going away. Some non-government organisations have got involved. There's an organisation called the Quakers, which is a religious organisation, which in Huddersfield are now holding weekly vigils outside Huddersfield University. The Students' Union are getting involved. And just recently, we found there is a couple of students who are Bahraini who have actually been tortured. They're now going to put pressure on the university as well to, again, say if you can't show how you're improving, then you have to suspend this course until evidence shows whether you're improving or what you're doing is giving techniques for them to undermine human rights.
I mean, given everything you've said, I suppose if you were in their shoes and somebody came along and said, okay, University of Huddersfield, Vice Chancellor, why don't you get somebody to do an independent review of this program and its impacts in order to make sensible recommendations about pulling out of the bits that could be harmful to human rights, that is to say, human rights of Bahraini people, but keep the bits that could uphold the rule of law and so on. Is that the kind of thing that a kind of discourse that you think has got traction? Could that kind of thing go forward?
Academics are used to peer review. You know, they're used to collaboration and peer review, and others exploring and critiquing what happens. It's a normal part of academia. I genuinely would have thought that an institution of higher education would wish to do that, particularly when significant allegations are brought before them and they're not able to answer what they're doing and how they're monitoring some of the issues that have been raised. It would seem to me pretty useful to get an independent review. I mean, again, if it's shown that Huddersfield's course hasn't improved human rights, surely it's a position of strong leadership then for the Vice Chancellor to withdraw. What is worrying and seems to be a complete denial that they may be implicated in human rights issues in Bahrain is a denial to have the investigations and the allegations looked into independently.
Callum Robertson for SALAM, what's SALAM's plans? What's your organization's plans to hold Huddersfield University to account?
So I think that there's several things we've got planned. I think that there is much to be said about working with the student union and with peers such as Paul and other figures to make a very public condemnation of it and ask for a very public response. But also, I think it comes back to our earlier conversation about soft diplomacy. I think we need to actually be willing to take meetings with the Vice Chancellor and actually convince him on the very real facts of what is happening, what his university is essentially. His university is making money off the back of torture. That's. I mean, it goes without saying that is obviously offends everything that we hold dear to ourselves as a British country, as our country. We shouldn't be allowing our educational institutions to provide those sort of services. I mean, Paul made a very good point at the start about academia having a very important role to play in enlightening countries, in pushing for change. But when we say that, the natural assumption is we spread things like free speech in other countries. We spread things like education, religious freedom, technical skills. We don't train people on techniques that may well tantamount to implicitly training on how to get away with torture. Essentially, I mean, this is serious, and I think there is something to be said about soft diplomacy having a role in stopping it. But also, I think we've tried the soft diplomacy. We've written in recent days, and the evidence suggests that soft diplomacy isn't working. That they're not willing to throw away what is a very lucrative program for them. It's at a time when they're looking to make cutbacks as well as university, as alongside the rest of the higher education sector. This is a very profitable sector for them. So I can see why they would be reluctant, but at what cost are they putting on human lives? So I think, we need to be prepared to go public and go hard at this and run a relentless campaign, because I'm convinced we can win it. We can win this argument, but I think we need to be prepared for the long haul.
Thank you very much, Lord Scriven, Paul Scriven, and Callum Robertson for Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. We've talked about the implications of the UK's Magnitsky inspired provisions, their application to Bahrain, the implications for the University of Huddersfield. Thank you both for your time, and until soon. And I hope to revisit this issue in about 6 months' time. Just pause
Thank you
there.
so much,
I'm going to stay on the line. Callum, you're going to stay on the line. Paul, just